Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Restless Heart Media for another episode of Unspoken Issues, candid conversation with clergy, where three of us, His Excellency Archbishop Meikle, Father Lafort, and myself, Father Martin, talk about things that pertain to the traditional movement that we see from a traditionalist priest perspective. Sometimes about the clerical sides of things, sometimes about our apostate towards lay people and what we see that could improve their lives also in growing in holiness and living out the Catholic vocation. Your Excellency Archbishop Miko, how are you doing tonight?
Very well. How are you? Happy Easter.
Happy Easter. Father Lafort, how are you? Happy Easter.
Excellent, better than the average Novus Ordo priest.
Okay, as we can see with your very happy cat in the background.
Yeah, he's relaxed. I wore him out beforehand, chasing a little feather thing on put on a
Wonderful.
fishing pole.
No falling iguanas.
No iguanas right now. Actually, they're floating away instead of falling out of the trees since we have a cold front down here in uh, Florida. So it means with 70 degrees with the cold front.
Exactly. Exactly. And I'm very thankful for that cold front. As we all know, we were Catholics, we are all these clergy where the cold fronts are very much appreciated. So tonight we have another very interesting topic that I'm sure many people will find uh, engaging, curious about it. One of the things that I, in particular, have been interested in trying to find more data about, especially, I mean, throughout my priesthood and getting to know more families, both that come in from the Novus Ordo into tradition and those who are young enough to start growing their families in tradition, how I've seen them raise their children, and all the certain perspectives is one thing. A moment that hit me, something that really hit me one day, is I had like three SSPX seminarians visit the Oblate of St. Augustine, and one of them told me that the vast majority of the SSPX seminary out in Virginia, the vast majority of the seminarians, they all grew up Novus Ordo. And I was struck by that in the sense that I myself grew up in the Novus Ordo Church, fell away from the church, had a reversion to the Catholic faith, and eventually, because of the catalyst of that reversion, continued to pursue those things that were more conservative. And ultimately, I discovered traditional Catholicism, and then, here I am. Here I am. And I think the three of us on this podcast tonight also can share a similar story in the sense that we all grew up going to the Novus Ordo. One of us got ordained in the Novus Ordo Church. So far as that, and we all discovered the truth and became trad. And it seems that the vast majority of traditionalist clergy have the same experience. So we can, from one perspective, say, "Wow, that's great, beautiful. All these Novus Ordites are really searching for the truth and discovering the faith." But, but on the other hand, and this is where my curiosity strongly lies, is with all these young traditionalist families, and even those who were holding the fort down from the 60s, the 70s, 80s, the ones who went to the underground chapels, who were still having, 8, 9, 10 kids, maybe even up to 15. Um, where are their children? Where are their children? And it wasn't maybe a year or two after the seminarian revealed this particular aspect to me that this what looked to me, what was a layman, but he was laicized. He was ordained a priest, but he was laicized. And he was telling me about his whole discernment process of deciding to be laicized and his superiors agreeing with his laicization. That I asked him, how many siblings do you have? And he said, I'm one of 15. And I said, how many other vocations did you have in your family? And he said, none. I was it. And then he left the priesthood, right? So this is a family that grew up in a uh, very strong Catholic, traditionalist Catholic family, and it only cemented kind of my question: is what is going on in large traditional Catholic families to where they are not the ones providing the vocations, those who want to consecrate their mind, heart, and soul in the most fullest way, live out their baptism in the most fullest way to God. Instead, it's up to those who maybe have just 1 or 2 kids because they grew up Noah's Ordo, natural family planning, all that kind of stuff. It's up to those families with 1 or 2 children that are the ones providing the traditionalist clergy. To me, that should be blowing our minds. Young families should be asking those questions, saying, what do I need to do as a parent? What do I need to live as a parent so that my 15 children will be able to end up like that of Louis and Zealot Martin, the parents of Saint Therese of Lisieux, where all 5 of their children, all of their children that survived to adulthood, entered religious life. What is it? What is it? What? Because many people, I think, seem to be searching for a silver bullet. Oh, as long as we go to the most beautiful mass where the priest is wearing all lace, and there's the beautiful incense and beautiful polyphony or Gregorian chant. If my children just experience this, then they'll want to be a Carmelite nun like Saint Therese of Lisieux. Not exactly. I mean, you read her own story of a soul. It's not exactly the case. So that's kind of like where I wanted to steer the conversation tonight is what exactly is it that produces a vocation? And maybe this might even start with our own vocation stories. This may even start with what pulled us out of the Novus Ordo Church, what got us searching for truth of the Catholic religion, the Catholic faith. And then also, I mean, in the way maybe we kind of see from all times and places of our apostolate, of our ministry as priests in different chapels and whatever else, what we might see that parents can pay more attention to or improve upon, or maybe how they even need to change their own personal life. That there's a strong relationship in the way a parent is living their own faith and how seriously their children take that faith. Because obviously, even as priests, we know our lay people see us, see the way we live our lives, and will decide to live accordingly or not. So it's very similar to parents. So I think we'll start with Archbishop Meikle. I mean, I guess we're starting with maybe more or less with general thoughts, maybe the first thing on your mind or whatever, but maybe we'll hit individual subjects. But I'm just interested. What's the first thing on your mind?
So there's a couple. So first of all, my parish year, as most priests are formed with seminary, and then they take a pause in either year 3 or year 4, and you do a practicum year. And in my practicum year, there was 2 families that were large, nine children each, and were very, very devout parents. And my understanding is only 1 of the 18 children still goes to mass. So, and I'll tell you right now, I mean, certainly from all that's visible, and there was nothing wrong with the parents. So, I mean, that doesn't mean to say that there wasn't other things that maybe they could have done different. But what I'm saying is they're still devout, beautiful Catholic parents. So the question, it's a multivariable problem. There's first of all, there's a perception, I think, among some traditionals that their vocation really won't be welcome, that they'll be thrown under the bus after they've been served in service for 10 years. So maybe there's a question of trust in divine providence there, but also a question of, go where you're welcome, not where you're barely tolerated. Then there's the other factor of, there seems to be a generational malaise that came from baby boomer parents, which is, pretty well our, well, maybe not Father Martin, but, certainly it was an impact for those families that I meant. And so there might be some sort of residual anthropology there. And then the third thing I would say is that sometimes when parents are very, very, very gung-ho and devout, there can be almost a counter reaction depending on the relationship of the children with the world. So it would be very interesting to know how many vocations come from homeschool, for example, homeschool environments or co-op or faith-based schools versus the public school system as one. And it is very interesting, though, that even a large family doesn't necessarily produce a lot of vocations. And, in my case, and perhaps in many vocations case, it's when you realize, when you make that decision to take your faith seriously, if you're young and you want to give all to God, then that means priesthood of the religious life. So that can be that can be the push to have that interest. Whereas if church is just something you do every Sunday, and yeah, you might pray the rosary as a family or what have you, there's not necessarily that linkage to this is what God wants me to do with my life. And so anyway, that's just some opening thoughts. I don't know if Father Lafort has something to add there too, but
Yeah, absolutely. I think on a practical level, those Catholics that grow up in a traditional setting that's more or less in isolation, in particular to the SSPX. Let me get that clear. I know the CMRI, they, I would say the majority of their priests actually come from them, that they actually replace themselves. But so kudos to the CMRI. I'm pretty sure I don't meet a lot of CMRI priests or know of many CMRI priests that actually come from the Novus Ordo to the CMRI. So I do think that there's 60 or so priests that actually come from their own ranks. So, but with the SSPX, what I do find is particular to them, because they have priories and they're not in local missions, that they don't have daily mass for a lot of their chapel sites. And when you don't have daily mass, you don't have Eucharistic adoration, different Catholic devotions. You don't, as a kid, you less exposure to the Holy Eucharist equals less vocations. I think whenever you have more exposure to the Holy Eucharist, you have more exposure to Mass, serving Mass, and not just holy days of obligation and Sundays. Young men see more the priest more often, and they're oftentimes inspired by the priest to ask the question, is God asking this of me too? So I think particularly with the SSPX, because they are quote unquote missionary and they live in priories, only a handful of locations that they actually have schools and where you can see the priest every day and actually have daily mass, those places are limited. I think that's actually a practical reason. I think the the I think that's my first thought. I know from myself because I went to mass every Sunday, of course, but when I was 14, discerning my vocation to the priesthood, I was able to actually go to daily mass during the summer and work retreats, and I had a lot of exposure to priests coming over to my house on Sundays, Easter, Christmas, different holidays for lunch. I had a lot of interaction with different clergy so throughout my life, and I think that's a big part of it too.
Okay, so we kind of touched a little bit about the organizations, more or less, like the SSPX, CMRI, and maybe children's exposure to the faith a little bit. One thing that I think in particular has touched me a little bit about rereading A Story of a Soul by Saint Therese of Lisieux is in particular how much her own parents and her own older sisters influenced her in the faith, in the sense that that takes a large majority, a huge chunk of the beginning part of her autobiography. But then she writes to her superiors. So this is like in addition to her autobiography, but it's included in The Story of a Soul. A particular letter that actually we just aired last night on Restless Heart Media, an apostle of prayer. And what struck me in particular was her devotion to Saint Mary Magdalene. And what the reason it struck me is because here's Saint Therese of Lisieux, a 15-year-old virgin who enters Carmel religious life, right? Finds incredibly inspiring a former prostitute. You would think many people would say today that the reverse should be the reality, right? The prostitute should admire the virgins and try to pursue what a virgin is living. But then there's this young woman who looks at Saint Mary Magdalene and she says, "I want what she wants, or I want what she has. I want what she has." And to me, that's very unique, because I think, at least in my initial conversion, when I was looking at when I had friends that were Catholics, I said that to myself all the time. There was a man who was very great in apologetics. I want what he has. I want to be good at apologetics as him. There was a guy who knew how to pray the liturgy of the hours, and I didn't know how to pray the liturgy hours, but he took this time to know the liturgical prayer. I want to go to him. Hey, what's that book? Teach me how to pray that. I want to do that. So I was always looking for someone who had something I didn't have, and I wanted them to teach me. I wanted to be formed by them. I was always constantly looking. And so here's this young woman who sees in Saint Mary Magdalene something that she does not have. She does not have, but that she wants. That she wants. But what is that? What is that? And ultimately, she finishes this chapter, an apostle of prayer, showing that because of her past, Saint Mary Magdalene was able to humble herself enough to a point to where it made her able to receive the love of God, his mercy, in such a way that she had to respond in as much of a radical way. And so she describes this as this inflamed heart. And of course, St. Augustine, here we have on Restless Heart Media, the little image on our YouTube of St. Augustine holding a heart and it's on fire, this inflamed heart. And we even say it in the second, in one of the blessings for the second nocturnes of Matins every single day. Lord, send your heart of fire to inflame my heart as well. This aspect of an inflamed heart. And I think that is ultimately what Saint Therese of Lisieux saw in her very own parents. It wasn't so much that they were as educated or as smart as St. Thomas Aquinas, or as externally pious, with so many devotions, reciting novena after novena after novena, chaplet after chaplet after chaplet. But I think she saw truly in her parents and truly in her sisters this unique, this divine fire in their heart that consumed their whole life. And so with that, I mean to say that I think it's, at least for myself, I remember my own past. I remember when my parents were telling me to do something and they also weren't living it themselves, right?
Mhm.
Where they were saying, do as I say, not as I do, sort of thing.
Mhm.
And so for me, and from her particular story, I think I'm sort of turning this still over in my mind, is that maybe in a lot of traditionalist families, we maybe tend to over prioritize just de fide believing in certain doctrines, and maybe the intellectual side of things, which is of course where the imitation of Christ comes in with the Devotio Moderna, where he combats this scholasticism intellectual aspect of the faith, where Thomas à Kempis says in the very first chapter, I would rather feel compunction than know how to define it. I would rather feel compunction than know how to define it.
Mhm.
Of course, there's this balance. Of course, we have to know the faith, of course. And especially when there's so many errors going on in the world, of course, we have to know, which way to follow. But the heart aspect of the faith, I think, may be diminished because we like to believe that as long as I die, having been absolved of my sins, as long as I went to confession yesterday, if I get in a car accident, I'm good. I'm good to go. Like, I'm in heaven. But is that really just the goal? Is that really just the goal? The goal of the Christian life is perfection, and perfection in charity. Is it really just the goal to just die having confessed? Okay. Your Excellency, I'm over you. I'm asking too many questions. Hold on. Let me put that screen here. Hold on. There we go.
You really hit something. You don't really want to approach our Lord. I love you, Jesus, just not that much. And so, we say we love God. Do we live that? And I think I'm as guilty as anyone who enjoys learning aspects of the faith, that it's easy to get caught up in the excitement of learning theology, learning philosophy, and these things, of course, are quite important. But again, if they're not, they're not combined with a prayer life and a life of mercy, corporal and spiritual works, then that faith can, it can end up very sterile. And you're right, you're doctrinally correct, but you could very easily end up with that kind of, well, as long as I'm in a state of grace, Lord, I made the cut, versus I want to give my whole life and heart to you, and I don't just want to make the cut. I want to be the saint that you called me to be.
Yeah, I want to add to that. This is a very good topic. There's the head and then there's the heart. There's the intellect and then there's the will. And I believe that whenever our wills are aligned, as Saint Thomas, Thomas à Kempis said, I don't care about defining compunction, or St. Francis says, I don't care about defining compunction as long as I feel it. When it comes to a vocation, it's God who calls the soul to this life. He calls the man to this life, and the church ratifies it and calls the man forward. But how does a man even listen to the voice of God unless he's willing to listen to the voice of God? And he's actually set on fire for the love of God. And that's actually probably to me the most important aspect of this. Like, you can't get somebody to actually discern the vocation to the priesthood unless they care. So if you don't care, then you're not going to hear the voice of God. I mean, people that are might be called to the priesthood, but they're actually high under a bridge right now from heroin, and
Mm.
they're living a very wayward life, or they've buried it in other some kind of worldly pleasure or pursuit. And oftentimes, um, the study of the faith is fun, but fall in love first, then study later. So actually, what I loved about what inspired me to become a priest was the invitation to discern the possibility that God was actually calling me to be a priest. And if he was, then I didn't want to tell him no. But then when I saw other young men who were on fire for the love of God, and they said to me, if you do what God wants you to do, you'll always be happy. But more importantly, fall in love with God, stay in love with God, and that will determine everything for you, because it's an answer to love. It's not an answer of saying, "Oh, I know who I am now." You know, who you are has to be based on a relationship. And I think, um, credit to, and I need to give credit in the Novus Ordo to the discernment programs that were there, and the priests that helped me discern, my spiritual directors, especially early on, and to whenever I did say, hey, I had the experience of the love of God, and and God spoke to me, and they let me talk about it and sift through all the distinctions and say, okay, yeah, after high school, I'm going to go into seminary, and I'm not going to waste any time because I'm in love with God and I'm in love with the church, and I'm in love with what God is revealing to me. So it was love that compelled me to want to know the truth, and to know the truth more and more and more. I consider myself a Catholic who became a Catholic who became a Catholic and is now becoming more Catholic. And we all should be in that pursuit of the truth. But part of it is love has to grow in our hearts along the way. I heard one parishioner of mine back in Louisiana, they said most people miss heaven by 12 inches.
Mm.
Most people are stuck in here and they're not here. And they
Mm.
separate. And there's actually a lot of priests that they miss heaven by 12 inches. They're up in here in their head. They know all the theology, or at least they claim to know all the theology, but they're actually not here. And God always had my heart first before he had my mind. And that's proof in how I was even able to pass metaphysics, because I was failing metaphysics the first semester, the first half of the semester for studying metaphysics. And if you don't understand what that is, don't worry about it. Don't waste your time. But no, it's not a waste of time. Okay, it's not. Metaphysics is very important, but I was failing it, and I realized if I can't study philosophy properly, if I can't pass metaphysics, I can't pass philosophy, I can't study theology, then I can't be a priest. And so I had this existential crisis that, I love you, God, but I don't know if I can make the grades. And I remember praying to God, just like, God, you need to help me. And I lifted up my eyes and I saw a crucifix on my desk, and it actually had a banner on the crucifix, and it said, Jesus is love. And I remember thinking to myself in that moment, oh, Jesus is not metaphysics, he is love. And so that inspired me again to say, okay, the whole heart of this of pursuit of vocation, the whole pursuit of higher learning is to fall in love with God. Now I said, okay, well, you have to resurrect the metaphysician in me, God. Okay, this doesn't, like, love is good and everything, but so we've got to deal with this issue of metaphysics. And later I discovered that actually Jesus is metaphysics too. But I had to be reminded that he is love first. And if love is the foundation of everything, charity is the foundation of everything. And I think that's part of the reason why I found myself in different traditional groups that aren't mainstream, because a lot of the mainstream groups, they focus on the head and not too much on the heart. And I find those priests that come from the Novus Ordo into tradition, they still haven't forgotten their heart. I think that's probably a big part of it, because so much of the Novus Ordo is focused on your personal experience with God.
Mhm.
Maybe, and whenever you talk about a homeschooling situation or a traditional Catholic situation, that's a universal situation. everybody's getting the same experience, but nobody might be having the invitation. But what is God actually telling you? Because there is a personal side to the faith. It's what Saint Therese loved so much about her vocation to the priest, to the vocation to religious life. It was she wanted a heart on fire for God. She saw a heart on fire for God and others, and it was particular. And we can't forget about the particular in the Catholic faith, that we do have particular experiences, but they should always be in line with the universal experience. And I think that's where tradition then catches up with the Novus Ordo, that people pursue the truth and the goodness and the beauty of God, so much so that they realize, oh, wow, the Novus Ordo is actually missing a lot of truth. And so if you want to uncover that truth, you have to make some sacrifices. And you actually have to go to the cross. And you have to go with Christ on Calvary, and you have to make serious sacrifices about your comfortability and your state in life, as far as your insurance, is your paycheck, your livelihood, all for the sake of the love of God. That's ultimately what it boils down to, I think, if we get to the pith of it.
How important, Father, do you think? Question for both of you. How important do you think it is to have, I guess, a friendly priest, or a priest there's some rapport with, in the case of priestly vocations, and to have religious, female religious, in the case of for female religious vocations? How important is that versus them consuming material on YouTube, etc.?
To be honest, it's actually something that I think, through my experiences, I've thought about a lot. I don't think it's so much important to have someone in your life with a veil or a collar on, per se. What I think is very important is to have someone very close to the parents, the mother and the father, who they trust, who they know their values and their faith align up 100%. Because this outside person, there's someone who's not really direct bloodline. I mean, it could be an uncle or an aunt or somebody like that, but I guess it's best that it really be someone outside of the family, per se, to give a second opinion to the children and to confirm to the children everything that their parents are teaching them, and giving their own personal experience and saying, listen, I was never subject to your father. I don't have to live by what your father is teaching you. I don't have to live by those values, but I myself choose those values because those values lead to happiness. This faith leads to happiness. So I'm not living my faith because your father tells me to live my faith. There's no authority he holds over me to live this faith. I'm living it because I firmly believe it's true, and it leads to happiness. And that's why I think first that says something to a young man, a son. For a daughter, I think more importantly too, I mean, a daughter, because this is just the nature of women, they'll accept that which is given to them by someone they are firmly confident knows that loves them for who they are, not for who they think, not for who the man thinks they are, but for who they actually are. Because I think one mistake actually a lot of traditionalist parents make is they see, have an innocent young girl in their arms when she's born, and they say, oh, she's so innocent, she's going to be a nun, and I'm going to love her so much, I'm going to tell her constantly throughout while she's growing up she's going to be a nun, and she's going to want to be a nun because she knows that will make me proud. But the young girl continues growing up, and she thinks, oh, my father only loves me if I become a nun. He doesn't love me for who I am. He only loves me if I'm that future nun. But then she grows, and she might play on that while she's a young girl and hasn't hit puberty yet or whatever else. But then she gets into her teenage years, she's like, you know what? That's not who I am. Or at least if that's who my father thinks I am, it doesn't matter if that's what I become. I know he doesn't love me for who I am. He only loves me if I become what he wants me to become. And so then she begins to rebel. She begins to feel like she lacks that love from her father. And then she goes looking for that love from another man. Problems. And so I think this may be one issue in some traditionalist families, is that they immediately impose vocations on their children. And so their children don't feel that necessary love from their parents, that unconditional love from their parents. But then going back to the original, how important is it to have someone from outside the family as a part of the family. I think it's essential to find somebody outside of your family who 100% believes in the faith that you do, and to understand and encourage vocations. Like, listen, if this is what your heart is telling you to do, if this is what our Lord's the Holy Ghost is putting in your heart and inspiring you to do, go. I had an older man sit down with me actually one time. This was still when I was like maybe within my first year or two in discerning religious life, and he was a millionaire. Okay, he was a millionaire, and I had two different millionaires. Actually, I'll tell the story of the two different millionaires in my life in helping my discernment. I was like 19 years old. I was in a very I was going to daily mass in a very affluent part of Nashville, and I was walking to mass. I see a car pull into the parking lot. It was a Maserati. Okay, so I'm like, oh, highfalutin, you know what I mean? And so I see the guy who walks out of the car and all that kind of stuff. We go to mass, and I'm searching for my faith. I have questions, and they're having coffee afterwards after daily mass, and I see a lot of the people go. I'm going just to see if there's anybody there I can talk to, just to point me in the right direction regarding my pilgrimage, so to speak. And this guy approaches me, shows me all those like Lighthouse, apologetic CDs, all that kind of stuff, like Skahan, all those apologetic guys. And so this was back when we had CDs and then iPods and those sorts of things. And we're sitting down having this conversation. He shows me on his phone, pictures of his family, 8 kids. Shows me a picture of his house, beautiful house, his military uniform with all these ribbons, all this kind of stuff, all of his success, all this kind of stuff. And of course, I know this is the guy who walked out of the Maserati. And he looks at me one day. I guess it's kind of has to do with you, Father Lafort, because I mean, here was my invitation. He asked me, "Have you ever thought about becoming a priest?" And I just looked back at this guy and I was like, "Why should I give up all the things that you won't?" And he just sunk in his chair, and I mean, he understood. It's like, why should I give all the things that you just showed me, the beautiful things that you have? But then I had another rich guy a couple of years later, once I was already in religious life, sit me down. Actually, he sat me down and he said, "Listen, Martin, I played all the best golf courses in this country. I've experienced all the best things. I have all these material things." And he actually, because he had me over at his house for dinner, I mean, a couple other religious over at his house for dinner. And he says, my house, my cars, the things that I own, I only still have them because my wife herself, she's not yet ready to renounce all these things. But if I could have my choice, I would not be living where I live. I would not be living where I live. And he looked at me and he said, by choosing religious life, you're not missing out on anything. You're not missing out on anything. Two completely different perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
Two completely different perspectives. And so I think this is one. I'm being distracted by all the bots we have an incredible amount of bots in our chat tonight, guys. Like, it's insane. I don't know what was going on, but anyway, maybe it's because I don't know. Anyway, just regarding, again, having somebody outside of your family involved in your life, but then also as parents, understanding that the material things you pursue will greatly affect your children's attachments. And so you want people outside of your family to confirm the values that you yourself as parents are teaching them.
Right.
Are teaching them, while at the same time you yourself, both with an inflamed heart, not just in your doctrine, but also in the way you're living your life. If you're living in a multi-million-dollar house, how are you going to tell your children that they should choose poverty? They should go be Franciscans. Like, how does that line up? It seems like almost hypocritical. I'm taking a lot of the floor tonight, which is very unusual of my case. But anyways, I'll pass it on to Father Lafort.
Sure. Going back to Bishop Meikle's original question, did priests have a big impact on my discernment? I would say absolutely, for the better and for the worst. Before I felt called to the priesthood, I always thought, man, this sermon could be done a lot better, or like we could do this in church a lot better. And I didn't know that these quiet critiques were the disquiet within my soul about why we needed tradition and not Novus Ordo. But and I actually told my Monsignor, growing up, Monsignor Francis Lejean, he's passed and gone to his judgment and a reward at this point, or God rest his soul. But I told him, he asked me at the end of Mass one day, he said, "So, Stephen, what do you think about my homily today?" And I said, "Well, Monsignor, I thought it was pretty good, but it could use a little more passion." And this was a guy that I was going to have lunch with later that day at the church organist's house. Happened to be my cousin Ruby Pierce. And he says, in a lot of humility, he says, "Passion, passion, I love it. Live life with passion." And he said later at dinner, like 20 minutes later, I saw him at lunch, and he says, "Stephen, are you living life with passion?" And that would be his thing with me ever since until the day he died. He would ask me if I'm living life with passion because I called him out and his sermons about that. He gave good content, but it needed to be from the heart. And I couldn't tell in my young punkish self that he was speaking from the heart. It's just that was his personality and temperament, and I was just a young overzealous punk. But anyway, fast forward, the priest that was newly ordained, right whenever I felt called to the priesthood, became my spiritual director, and that priest was instrumental in every year of my life from 15 to 16 years old, all the way till a year before I was ordained a priest. So a year before I was ordained a priest, he was intimately involved in my life, and then he backed away. But there was something he told me back in high school. And I would say, before I start this, I should have said too, you know how some people say it doesn't take a family, it takes a village. For me to become a priest, it took a village. It took the entire seminary, all the priests, all the bishops, all the formation directors, all the youth ministers. I think of all the retreat masters, all the retreats that I worked, all the retreats I attended. I think of all the places I've been. It really took a village to raise my vocation. So I didn't need just one third party, like Father Martin mentioned. I needed like 500.
Mm.
So I had I had 500 third party members that had the same values, at least that I thought had the same values as me. And this one priest though, the newly ordained one, whenever I felt called to the priesthood, he told me this at like a second meeting. He told me this. He said, when a priest goes away on an assignment somewhere else across the diocese or another side of the country, what changes in that relationship between that priest and that spiritual directee, the spiritual director and the directee? What changes in that relationship? I said, and at the time I was just a teenager, so gave a teenager answer. I said, well, nothing really changes except that the spiritual relationship's still there. It's just from a distance. And he says, no, it actually is. You move on. And I forget. He came from a position, well, when you change locations, like you change everything and you move on. And I think he was just planting the seed of separation from me from a very long time. But I remember, I don't know if I need to digest that, but I've been trying to digest that for like 20 years, 30 years. Um, you know, 24 years I've been trying to digest that comment. But it goes to show you how the priesthood does move, and your Calvary moves. And a priest's life is Calvary, and it's outside the city walls, and so it's not connected to where the mainstream is. And that was one thing. The last message that priest ever gave me was actually at another priest's first mass, my classmate's first mass, and so I was actually deaconing that mass, and the sermon, the homily that priest gave, the same priest gave, 14 years later, he said, your address, no matter where your address is going to be Calvary. And, he gave the address of when you were a kid, this one house address when you moved across town, whenever you went to school, wherever you went to church. But now that you're ordained a priest, your address is Calvary. And then it clicked for me, and I haven't spoken to this priest in, I would say, probably a decade. I think it's actually a decade now. I haven't spoken to this priest, and I haven't even seen him. And if you had to ask where am I at now, my answer would be my address is Calvary. But there's certain things, I ask myself, am I living life with passion? And is my address still Calvary? And even to this day, if he's ever going to hear this, I want him to know. I want him to know that, yeah, my address is Calvary. That's where I'm at. You know where to find me. You know, it's with like Christ crucified, and Christ says, "I want you to be crucified over here. I want you to be crucified over there," and you go because love compels you to do it. And yeah, so that's along the way. It took a village for me. It took a village of priests. Lord knows I needed it. So that's my 2 cents. It's a good question.
Your Excellency, do you have an answer to your own question?
Well, I was blessed with the priests that I encountered were all good men. And even the ones that were not traditional loved God and served their people. So I had a lot of good examples. In my case, it wasn't an influence because although baptized Catholic, I wasn't. My parents were children of the 60s. My mother, when the Novus Ordo changes came in, she and her mother refused to participate in the new, and there was no access to tradition. And my father was Presbyterian, but he was the first Protestant principal of a Catholic school full of nuns, and he had priests that were friends. And so it's kind of a weird background. And I was inclined to faith at a very young age. I read early, read the whole Bible through. My grandmother gave me a little office of the Blessed Virgin in my early teenage years. And so I was a very odd, I was a square peg in a round hole. And basically, to preserve family peace, I was asked by my family, even though I was religiously inclined, not to formally participate in church until I was in university to avoid a feud. So that's what happened. And I went to a university that used to be a seminary, and it ceased becoming a seminary in 1932. So all its books were old, and fell in love with the faith. And there was an excellent university chaplain there. And when I think about it, all those priests love God and were an example to me. But my decision to really seek priesthood or discern priesthood came before I even met that university chaplain. And so he was a positive influence after I decided my whole life has to be for God. And what that would look like was, he gave me all the resources I needed to help discern that. And then, of course, you run into, because product of the age, this would have been in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. There's a lot of church politics. The diocese I was originally studied for was very synodal. They didn't call it that, but they had everything was by committee. And that got very discouraging because that wasn't the synodal. If you're not built synodally, it's a huge discouragement. And to make a very long story short, the early seminary years was battling this synodality versus a seminarian having a relationship with his bishop and formation director.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we've touched on quite a few things here. We've touched on, the last subject of having priests being present, or consecrated people, nuns, priests, present in life of your children. We've talked about the lives of parents being authentic and not just merely intellectual, not just feeding your children the intellectual side of the faith, but also trying to inflame their heart, which actually, maybe this is exactly what I actually wanted to go somewhere else, but maybe I'll make a little pit stop here and talk a little about St. Alphonsus Liguori on his advice to parents. Before I get to another subject, is also so advice, St. Alphonsus Liguori's advice to parents, but also maybe something that's more pertinent to our time, in the fact that Father Lafort mentioned how important it was for him to go to daily mass when he had the opportunity in the summers to go to the daily mass. For me, that was a big thing actually too in my conversion, is that if our Lord is present here in the tabernacle, it makes sense that I should visit him at least 10 minutes every single day. If this is God, I should visit him. And if he loves me, I should make the effort back to visit him. And so the availability, because I was only 15 minutes away, I can get there, of the Blessed Sacrament, to me, very much inspired my vocation. Now, before we get to St. Alphonsus, maybe I'll hit this point. Many traditionalist families want the multiple acres, farms, return to the land kind of idea. And what that requires of them is to live 45 minutes, an hour and a half away from a church, a traditional church. So their children don't have the opportunity, as St. Teresa of Lisieux even mentions in her own autobiography, of just passing by a convent, passing by a monastery, passing by a church, walking in, making a quick visit to the tabernacle, to the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and then continuing on their walk, going to daily mass. They don't have this opportunity. Their parents are depriving it from them to give them no neighbors within a mile so that they're not contaminated by the world. But at the same time, depriving of them of access to our Lord in the Blessed Sacrament. Big, like, okay, where's the balance way here? Where's the balance way? Keeping them from the world, depriving them from the Blessed Sacrament and visits.
You hit something, because I think all three of us had access to the Blessed Sacrament in our discernment time.
Oh,
100%. All three of us did.
And that's a big thing. So, Your Excellency, what do you think in this balance between protecting them from the world and then depriving them of visits to the Blessed Sacrament?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that is just sort of a necessity of this age is that a lot of traditional parishioners travel quite a bit to get to their church. And just the logistics of it, just the nature of affordable land for a young family and all that kind of stuff. It's a very complicated thing. And then also, I mean, there's a big difference when you have Catholic churches everywhere versus, only one traditional and a whole bunch of crazy ones. It's hard to actually locate yourself. I mean, we even tell people that are, they want traditional mass, they have no access to it. And very often all three of us have had to say, if you can swing it, you should consider relocating. And then, as you say, they'll relocate, but it's 45 minutes away from the church because, I mean, a lot of it, I think, Father, is affordability. It's not that their choice.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it's just unfortunately a wound of this age. We don't have little villages with the Angelus bell ringing and everybody able to walk to the church if they wanted to visit the Blessed Sacrament.
Yeah, you're right. We're very spread out as far as the traditional clergy are concerned. I mean, and the Novus Ordo is spoiled with having a church on every corner, and or at least every. I guess in New York City, it's probably like every block. Every 2 blocks has a Catholic church. You kind of, spoiled in that way. Even in Florida, we have a megalopolis here on the Atlantic coast. From Miami all the way to Jupiter. And I'm not talking about the planet. I'm talking about actually the town Jupiter, which covers 3 different counties. It's 3 counties long. It's one big megalopolis, and there's Catholic churches everywhere. Yet I'm the only priest who wears a cassock and a soterno out in public, and I'm the only one who belongs to the church where no one's ever heard of, and and slowly getting known and figured out. But where's the faith? I mean, what's really sad is that the Novus Ordo has the biggest population of Catholics, so they have the biggest opportunity for vocations, and I think that's where they have so many coming out with vocations, because they're focusing on the individual's experience of God, yet at the same time, what they're promoting is so synodal that it's actually a turnoff for those that are called to the religious life or priesthood. So they're forced to actually look for and seek, and you will find, knock, and the door shall be opened, the traditional clergy and communities. I would love nothing more than to be like St. Benedict, leave the city of Rome, go into the hills, start a monastery, then all of a sudden, 200 years later, you have a village cropped up around a monastery. And, you can have those Angelus bells ring, and you can have a place focused on God. People do want to move out to the land, and there is a return to the land movement. But where you going to get your priest? Mm-hmm. Don't make these plans to move to the middle of nowhere in Alabama, or the middle of nowhere in Louisiana, or the middle of nowhere in Mississippi or middle of nowhere in Florida, if there's still land left, not the Everglades, um, at least down here, uh, to actually and bring a priest with you. And at the same time, the human condition is always going to be the human condition. So you have to make sure that that priest and that there's actually an elected mayor that helps bring virtue and has proper philosophical training, has proper theological training, uh, so that the church and state can work hand in hand. You know, the king back in Christendom days was a philosopher and a theologian as well as the bishop was. So the king could take proper orders from the bishop. That's part and parcel what made Christendom so great, was that the church and state worked together as one. And so, in the same thing with the family and the church, because the family is the building block of the state, and the church guides the family, and the church guides the state. So, family and church have to go hand in hand. It's just as the church and state goes hand in hand. Uh, yeah, it, I don't know where I grew up. Let me give you kind of an idea of where I grew up in South Louisiana, in South Lafourche. I'm going to say that as English as I can, as South Lafourche, or South Lafourche as they say down the bayou. But there was 4 Catholic churches in every town. 4 small towns and a river, and on the bayou, you had Our Lady of the Rosary, Sacred Heart and Cutoff, St. Joseph and Galliano, and then you had Our Lady of Prompt Succor and Golden Meadow. Those 4 towns were only like 5 miles maximum apart. And so if you were the pastor of one of those churches, you were basically the mayor of that town, because there were no mayors except for Golden Meadow had a mayor. But if you were the pastor, you were basically the baby king of that town. And so you had a lot of clout and a lot of say, and it's like the end of the world. And so it's a good way not to be seen. So of course, what is the devil going to do? Put his finger into it and put some synodality in there, and then he ruins that country style life, that rural, slow paced life. And um, now, it's not nearly what it used to be. I mean, the priests with the youth groups used to be everybody that was in that grade was in part of the youth group. Now you got maybe lucky if you have 5% of that grade population of, like, let's say 10th graders, like 5% might go to church on Sunday, and they find it irrelevant. But it was nothing to go 40 years ago, 50 years ago. Everybody that was in the 10th grade was going to youth group at the church, and they were following the priest. Now, of course, they were getting synodality and Novus Ordo out of the faith. They all left after they got confirmed. They all graduated from Jesus, and so they all left. But and also too, that economically forced people to leave because they couldn't find good jobs. How are you going to sustain yourself in this rural type of situation to actually work a proper economy? And that's kind of the struggle that the people down the bayou face today. And I know a lot of young men, they want to stay and fight, and I love that. And in fact, I wanted to be the priest for those men. And then, life had took other turns. People with powers beyond myself, gave me a different path, or forced me to take a different path. And um, but I dream about those days of being down the bayou and being in a rural towns connected, and there's culture. There, we had our own music, we had our own food, we had our own language. I mean, I could go down there and speak the same language those people do today, and it's vocabulary that's way different than you would never guess what people were saying. And God blessed me whenever I came down here to South Florida. He gave me one Cajun from my hometown. One Cajun actually lives 30 minutes north of me, and he and I were sharing some burgers with a girlfriend of his, and we were talking in our Cajun dialect, and she didn't know what was going on. And it was amazing that I was here, 14 hours away from home, and away in a foreign place, land flowing with coconut milk and palm honey and palm sugar, not milk and honey, but palm sugar and coconut milk. And here I'm finding myself in Cajun with another Cajun talking, and it was so good because he has the same Catholic faith I do, and that's something treasured. And I think the Antichrist forces don't want that. There's I don't know. There's actually a very powerful passage in Leviticus 26 that I found about the blessings and the curses if you do keep the first three commandments right.
Hmm.
So if you keep the first three commandments, God gives you all these blessings. You get to stay in the land that you belong to your fathers. You will always have abundant harvest. You will always have, Sabbath rest, and you'll have to throw away your old storage from previous years in order to make room for the new storage, because you'll always have over an abundance. But if you don't keep the Sabbath, if you don't worship the one true God, if you don't keep His name holy, then He'll give you all these curses. And part of the curses are that your children will end up dying in lands foreign to their fathers. And it's also one of them is you will eat and consume your own sons and daughters. That's another curse. And that's in Leviticus chapter 26. Those promises God still gives us today, and those curses. And so it's worth reading those curses. But I think part of that vocation crisis is that God is using the humble, the Novus Ordo, that doesn't have very much Catholic faith, to actually using the humble to humble the proud, those in tradition that should be the ones producing the vocations to the priesthood. It's actually the Novus Ordo that's doing it. I think that's part of the divine thing of God, to just turn everything on its head, and he humbles the exalted and he exalts the humble. I think that's part of it too.
Yep. Absolutely. So last bit that I want to talk about, only because I brought it up on Twitter a couple of times. I know Father Dave Nix has reproduced the article. It's a short little treatise by St. Alphonsus Liguori on advice to parents. I know we all love St. Alphonsus. He's our guy when it comes to moral theology. Oh man, he's doctor of church. Better not contradict St. Alphonsus. Love that guy. But he lays out something hard for fathers. Lays down something very hard for fathers in his advice to parents. And he says that the fathers should lead the family every day in mental prayer. The father should lead the family every day in mental prayer, and make sure his children get to confession and to communion as often as possible. Now, especially back in his day, I could see it being even more difficult, because the rules for communion weren't the same as they are now, because Pope St. Pius X in the early 19th centuries uh, actually changed their age for First Holy Communion from like 14, 15, 16 down to the age of reason, to 7. That was a big shift there. And then, of course, you had the midnight fast for receiving Holy Communion. That was then changed by Pope Pius XII in 1953 to the 3-hour fast rather than the midnight fast. And the midnight fast included no water. So there were very strict rules that may have meant you, if you wanted to get your child to communion frequently in the age of St. Alphonsus, that you were waking them up at 4 a.m. to get them to mass at 5 a.m. because that's when mass was, because the priest couldn't drink water until he consumed the hosts and the precious blood. And so there's all of those, this historical context that we have to put into play in these sorts of things. But nevertheless, I wanted to ask you guys particularly about this. And again, we've brought up the access, the availability to the Blessed Sacrament in the development of priestly vocations for the three of us, for even our own lives. But in a capitalist society, in a very busy society, where maybe we can say that it's justifiable that for financial reasons that people live 45 minutes away from mass, because it's just not affordable to be closer. How do we interpret St. Alphonsus's suggestion, advice to fathers?
Well, the first thing is what Alphonsus is saying is that it's a prime responsibility of fatherhood to tend to the souls of his wife and his children. So a big part of that is access to Holy Mass, and mention he should lead his family in daily prayer, and also the whole conduct of the family. I mean, even modern, whether you call it anthropology or psychology, even modern studies have shown it's the faith, the practical faith, like in terms of not what the father believes, but what he does. So if the father is a daily mass attender and a Sunday mass attender, that is the biggest predictor for the children. It's not the mother, interestingly enough. In our churches, a lot of churches are almost full of women and only one or two males, especially in older communities. But the thing is, it's the father's participation in the sacraments and in the spiritual life of the church, like mental prayer, that is a predictor of the children's habit. And so, that's probably a scope bigger than we have tonight to discuss why it's dad, not mom.
Hmm.
But I would just say that, yeah, that's something that a modern dad, a 21st century Catholic dad, is going to take to heart. What is he doing? And I would say it's not simply demanding the children follow a routine. Routines are important, but the first step is to look at what is he doing to provide for their spiritual needs and sort of the greater scheme. I would say that, how that unfolds, in terms of leading them in mental prayer, or whether daily mass is possible, or how far of a drive is Sunday mass. Those are all under the overall responsibility the father has to realize. He bears a burden for the spiritual leadership of his family in a way that his wife does not.
Mhm.
And he should give that some thought.
And although it's of the temporal, which is less than the supernatural, the requirement, the obligation to provide is of absolute necessity. Obviously, if you lose your house, where's your family supposed to go? I mean, you
Mhm.
can't just lose your house. You can't just not provide bread and water, for your family. So these things are important. Nevertheless, because it's not to the degree of if I don't go to work, my family has no place to live. Mental
Right.
prayer, nevertheless, on a supernatural level, is of the same degree as important. Saint Teresa of Avila says, if you don't pray 30 minutes of mental prayer every single day, then we don't need a devil to tempt us because we've already condemned ourselves. So
Yes.
she gives us these stark words of how important it is in one's own very life, and that children should be brought up with knowing how to practice this, and that the father has that responsibility, like a priest in a sense, to be a spiritual father within the family, to lead them, to instruct them in this practice. And it has its methods, it has its process, and so it's not something that, well, it is something that one can Saint Teresa of Lisieux kind of shows us in her autobiography how she naturally came to having the fruits of this mental prayer. But nevertheless, I mean, we're all not Saint Teresa of Lisieux. Um, it requires some instruction and some habit forming, the ability that your children form the habits by continual practice. And so, the importance that fathers take the time to do that. I mean, fathers will also take time to hang out with friends, to have their own recreation, to then go back to their families and be good fathers and husbands to them. They take time, carve out time to spend with their wives and play with children, but then to instruct children, inform them in the spiritual life, in particular in one of the most important spiritual practices that exist, aside from attending mass, but practicing mental prayer. For Lafort, I know you disappeared here for a second. I don't know if you're caught up in the conversation, but would you like to have a word on this particular aspect
I
of
was a
St.
little
Alphonse, of course?
I was a little scared that Catholic
Well,
rapture happened and we were left behind, Father. I'm joking, by the way. We don't have Catholic rapture. We're joking.
well, well, I like to keep everybody on the edge of their seat, and you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, very good. So when it comes to St. Alphonsus, thanks be to God for him. And I know that from my perspective, my mom and dad made Sunday Mass non-negotiable. So we came 15 minutes before Mass so that we could pray at Our Father, Hail Mary, and Glory Be, and read the Sunday readings that day, and then recollect ourselves before the start of Mass. So we weren't walking in right as Mass started. We weren't walking in when Father started his homily, or we weren't, we walked in 15 minutes early. So that was non-negotiable. And there was a Sunday routine. If we needed, and that was another reason too, 15 minutes early, so that if we needed to go to confession, we could go to confession to the priest beforehand. So I was raised with that concept that you don't receive the Eucharist if you're conscious of mortal sin. I didn't know that St. Alphonsus said that, but I can say that that makes a lot of sense, because I definitely was raised that way. And of course, there was communion on the hand until I realized, oh, wow, I actually love Jesus and I don't want crumbs of him to be on the ground. So then it became on the tongue. And I think that was whenever 14 years old and afterwards became, on the tongue only. And my dad would always receive on the tongue. My mom received on the hand, which is funny because my mom is the more religious one. And my dad he knelt when he prayed. Seeing my dad kneel to pray was very powerful. To see him have prayerful hands and receive on the tongue. But I never would have considered him the strong spiritual one in the family, but he always backed up what my mom taught about the faith. And they were simpatico and all that. When it comes to, if you're not raising your children to go to confession regularly, if they need to go to confession, then you're doing it wrong. And the mental prayer part, that's something that we didn't do. I mean, we said grace before meals, and we said night prayers like an Our Father, Hail Mary, and Glory be before going to bed. But to say we're going to do some spiritual reading for Lent during dinner, that was like, we never heard of that. It wasn't until I got to seminary that I heard about, spiritual reading during dinner, which is actually a very potent thing to do. And it's a good way to control your appetites, to say, okay, everybody eats while dad reads from a passage of the Bible or a passage of the Gospel of the day, or actually the instruction of St. Augustine. Father Martin has done that many Mondays with different families, reading from that instructional rule of life. And it's so practical of how monks should live, but it's also how brothers and sisters and families should treat each other. So it's really good with addressing how kids should behave at table even. So look, we can't read from the lives of the saints enough. We can't read from the advice they give to parents enough. And Lord knows there will be a better place if we read more St. John Chrysostom on the Red Sea pedestrians.
Uh-huh. Well, with that, Your Excellency, Reverend Father, we've come to an hour here on Restless Heart Media on Unspoken Issues. We've tackled the subject tonight, vocations and the trad movement, where they're coming from, why they're not coming from, where they should be coming from, and maybe how we can address this. So hopefully this episode can bear fruit in some families' lives, give them some sort of direction on how to raise their children, maybe correct themselves in their own lives, maybe just make some minor adjustments, whatever it takes. Maybe just at least at the very least, just cause some reflection to see what one could always be doing better, because we do examination of conscience every single night. Why? Because we're constantly in need of correction. We're constantly need to have this self-reflection to see, where can I get better? Where in my day did I love God? Where I did succeed? That's important. But then where did I fail, and where can I get better? That's also very important. So hopefully this episode could be contributive to that effort and cause some more traditionalist Catholic priestly vocations. So thank you all again. This Friday night, we're back on Restless Heart Media for Friday Night Leisure. We're with Alberto and I to discuss anything you want to talk about in the chat, any questions you might have. Just ask away. We will talk about whatever you want to talk about. That's this Friday Night Leisure. So thank you all again for tuning in to Unspoken Issues, Candid Conversation with Clergy. And feel free in the comments to suggest other topics you might want us to talk about in the future. So, yeah, we'll see you in the comments. God bless.